What if the most misunderstood strategist in history wasn't warning us about warfare, but about bankruptcy? What if the art of war wasn't a manual for victory, but a manual for national survival, written by a man who saw states destroying themselves not through defeat on the battlefield, but through the cost that came afterward? Across centuries, we've treated Sun Tzu as a prophet of combat, a wise general whispering secrets of deception and dominance. But what if we've been reading him wrong? What if Sun Tzu's real fear wasn't the enemy in front of you, but the economy behind you? What if every line we think is about strategy is actually about cost control, risk mitigation, and the financial limits of power? And what if the greatest collapse in any civilization's history always begins the moment its leaders forget that wars are paid for in coin, long before they are paid for in blood? Welcome to Fiscal Flair. To understand Sun Tzu's true brilliance, you have to forget almost everything popular culture has told you about him. Before he became a symbol for entrepreneurs, influencers, and armchair strategists, he lived in a world on the edge of economic collapse, a China fractured into competing kingdoms, all convinced that unification was within reach, and all bleeding themselves dry trying to seize it. This was not an age of noble duels or poetic heroism. It was an age of financial exhaustion. Armies had grown too large to sustain without massive taxation. Campaigns had grown too long to wage without draining agricultural labor. Warfare had transformed from aristocratic ritual into a brutal industrial-scale enterprise that demanded grain, metal, manpower, logistics, bureaucracy, a machinery of cost that spiraled with every marching step. Every time a king moved an army, he was gambling with his kingdom's solvency. Every prolonged campaign was a loan taken out against the future, a loan many states never managed to repay. It was into this world, this landscape of spiraling budgets, failing treasuries, and rulers who confused ambition for strength, that Sun Tzu emerged, not as a romantic general dreaming of glory, but as the first strategist to recognize that war was an economic crisis disguised as a military one. He saw what no one else wished to confront, that states were not collapsing because they were weak on the battlefield. They were collapsing because they were broke. War was not destroying armies. It was destroying economies. And so Sun Tzu sat down, not to teach kings how to triumph, but to teach them how to survive. The art of war was not written to glorify conflict. It was written to contain it. It is a book about restraint, about risk, about the thin line between national strength and national self-destruction. A book that tells us, before anything else, that war is of vital importance to the state, not because it's noble, but because it's dangerous. And as we follow Sun Tzu's logic through the centuries, we begin to see the truth he understood long before modern economics existed. War is not a test of bravery. It is a test of solvency. And most rulers fail that test long before the first sword is drawn. Long before Sun Tzu wrote a single line, China was already dissolving under the weight of its own ambitions. Dozens of kingdoms, each convinced it was destined to rule all others, expanded their armies faster than their economies could sustain. Every ruler dreamed of unification. Every minister promised victory. Every campaign demanded more men, more metal, more grain, and the treasuries emptied as quickly as the promises filled them. This was the late spring and autumn period, a time when warfare had outgrown the aristocrats who once controlled it. Battles were no longer elegant affairs fought by elite charioteers. They had become massive infantry clashes requiring food supply chains that stretched for miles, armories churning out standardized weapons, and bureaucracies large enough to manage the never-ending flow of resources. War was no longer an act of courage. It was an act of consumption. Every march devoured grain. Every siege devoured manpower. Every prolonged conflict devoured the very foundation of the state. And because every kingdom feared falling behind its rivals, they all escalated at once. It was a geopolitical race, but it was also an economic one, a competition to see which state could survive its own spending the longest. An army in the field for a single season could cripple a small state. An army in the field for a year could collapse a large one. And yet the wars continued because insecurity powered ambition, and ambition powered disaster. Kings didn't just gamble with soldiers, they gambled with harvests, with currency, with the structural integrity of their nations. They treated warfare as a path to greatness while ignoring the financial wreckage accumulating behind them. Victory was often indistinguishable from ruin. A kingdom could win a decisive battle and lose half its tax base doing it. It could conquer new territory and lack the resources to hold it. It could taste glory in the moment and insolvency in the aftermath. This was the world Sun Tzu inherited, a world where strategy had become disconnected from cost, where rulers chased prestige instead of stability, where war was transforming into the fastest path to national bankruptcy. It was not a world in need of a warrior. It was a world in need of a risk analyst. And that is precisely what Sun Tzu became. Before he taught generals how to deceive, before he taught them how to maneuver, before he taught them how to break an enemy's will, he taught them how to keep their own state alive. Because he saw what the kings did not, war is a debt, and most kingdoms were spending capital they no longer had. As armies grew larger, war stopped being a matter of bravery and became a matter of accounting. Before a single soldier reached the battlefield, the costs had already begun to accumulate. Grain had to be harvested, stored, and transported. Metal had to be mined, smelted, and forged into weapons. Horses had to be bred and fed. Laborers had to be pulled from farms and workshops to serve as porters, cooks, armorers, and engineers, and all of it had to be paid for. Sun Tzu understood something that most rulers refuse to confront. The moment an army leaves home, the state begins hemorrhaging resources. Distance multiplied expense, time multiplied risk, delay multiplied ruin. A campaign that lingered too long did not merely exhaust soldiers, it exhausted the economy that supported them. This is why Sun Tzu warned, with almost brutal clarity, that no nation had ever benefited from prolonged warfare. Not because battles were dangerous, but because they were financially unsustainable. Every additional day in the field meant higher transport costs, higher food consumption, higher strain on agricultural production, and higher taxes imposed on a population already stretched thin. And those taxes carried their own cost. Farmers who lost sons to the army lost hands for the harvest. Merchants who lost laborers lost output. Communities that lost stability lost loyalty. A war fought too long began eating its own foundation. Sun Tzu watched kingdoms spiral into this trap again and again. They mistook momentum for strength. They mistook persistence for resolve. They believed that continuing to fight proved commitment, even as their treasuries collapsed beneath them. But Sun Tzu saw the hidden math. A ruler could win every engagement and still destroy his state. He could occupy territory that cost more to hold than it would ever produce. He could defeat enemies abroad while creating rebellion at home. This is why Sun Tzu shifted the entire conversation. He stopped asking how to defeat the enemy and started asking something far more dangerous. What does this victory actually cost? Because in his world, and in ours, the most catastrophic defeats are the ones that arrive after the war is won. Sun Tzu wasn't afraid of losing battles. He was afraid of winning the wrong ones, and that insight would redefine everything that followed. Sun Tzu's most famous line has been misunderstood for centuries. When you subdue the enemy without fighting, that is the acme of skill. It's quoted as mysticism, it's framed as psychological genius, it's shared like a riddle. But in Sun Tzu's world, this was not poetry, it was accounting. Avoiding battle wasn't about elegance, it was about preserving capital. Every clash avoided meant grain not consumed, horses not lost, weapons not broken, laborers not pulled from fields, and taxes not raised to cover the damage. Sun Tzu realized something revolutionary. The cheapest war is the one you never fight. If you can break an enemy's will through intimidation, through alliances, through misinformation, through timing, through pressure that never becomes open conflict, you have achieved the objective without triggering the financial avalanche that follows a conventional campaign. This is why deception occupies such a central place in his work, not because deception is clever, but because it is cheap. A rumor costs nothing. A false movement costs nothing. A misdirected enemy army cost them everything. Sun Tzu's strategy was not about overwhelming force. It was about asymmetry, spending less than your opponent while forcing them to spend more. Let them mobilize, let them march, let them feed armies that never fight. Let them drain their own treasuries while you conserve yours. Victory, in Sun Tzu's framework, was not measured in territory taken, but in balance sheets preserved. And this is where his thinking became deeply subversive. In a world that glorified martial valor, he argued that restraint was the highest form of strength. In a culture that equated action with leadership, he argued that not acting could be the most intelligent choice. In an era where kings proved legitimacy through conquest, he argued that conquest was often the fastest path to internal collapse. Sun Tzu wasn't telling rulers to be timid. He was telling them to be solvent. Because the real enemy, the one that destroyed states far more reliably than rival armies, was exhaustion. Economic exhaustion, social exhaustion, political exhaustion. And once a state reached that point, no victory on the battlefield could save it. This was the logic that separated Sun Tzu from every strategist who came before him. He was not trying to outfight the enemy. He was trying to outlast them. Speed, in Sun Tzu's writing, has always sounded like aggression. Speed is the essence of war, he says, a line often read as a call to strike first, strike hard, and strike fast. But once again, the popular interpretation misses the deeper logic. Sun Tzu was not obsessed with speed because it won glory. He was obsessed with speed because it reduced cost. Every extra day an army marched was another day of feeding mouths, transporting supplies, repairing equipment, and compensating labor diverted from the economy. Time, in Sun Tzu's calculus, was money, and delay was debt. A swift campaign minimized exposure. A decisive maneuver reduced logistical strain. A fast resolution prevented the cascading failures that prolonged warfare, triggered inflation, unrest, agricultural collapse, political instability. Speed was not about violence. It was about containment. This is why Sun Tzu warned commanders never to let wars linger out of pride or indecision. A campaign that drags on does not prove resolve. It proves mismanagement. Every moment wasted in the field increased the risk that the war would begin to undermine the very state fighting it. And Sun Tzu understood that the greatest danger of delay was not the enemy's counterattack. It was domestic collapse. Taxes rise. Labor disappears. Food prices climb. Public patience erodes. Confidence in leadership weakens. A ruler can survive defeat. He cannot survive insolvency. This is why Sun Tzu emphasized timing over force. He urged commanders to strike where the enemy least expected it, not to show brilliance, but to avoid the cost of resistance. A battle avoided through surprise saved more resources than a victory won through attrition. A city taken without siege preserved more wealth than one captured after months of starvation and destruction. Sun Tzu saw war as a narrowing corridor. With each passing day, options closed and costs rose. Speed kept that corridor wide. It preserved flexibility. It preserved morale. It preserved capital. And most importantly, it preserved the ruler's ability to walk away from war without having destroyed his own future. Sun Tzu was not teaching kings how to conquer quickly. He was teaching them how to exit war before it devoured everything. Sun Tzu's obsession with intelligence was never about secrecy for its own sake. It was about cost control. In every era before him, rulers treated intelligence as a luxury, something useful if available, but secondary to force. Sun Tzu reversed that logic entirely. To him, intelligence was not an accessory to war. It was the cheapest weapon a state could ever deploy. A single accurate report could prevent an army from marching in the wrong direction. A single intercepted message could save months of supply costs. A single well-placed spy could spare a kingdom from a disastrous campaign that would have drained its treasury dry. This is why Sun Tzu ends. The art of war not with tactics or formations, but with spies. Not heroes, not warriors, accountants of reality. He understood something most rulers did not. Misinformation is expensive. Marching blindly wastes food. Fighting the wrong enemy wastes lives. Defending the wrong territory wastes money. And every error multiplies the cost of war. Foreknowledge, as Sun Tzu called it, was simply data. And data allowed rulers to allocate resources efficiently. He writes that what enables the wise sovereign to achieve victories beyond ordinary reach is not bravery, but knowing what lies ahead. This wasn't mystical foresight. It was risk management. Sun Tzu looked at war the way a careful steward looks at a collapsing budget. You don't commit resources until you understand the variables, and ignorance, in his framework, was not a moral failure. It was a financial one. A ruler who marched without intelligence was gambling national capital on hope. A ruler who relied on rumors was speculating with the lives of his people. A ruler who ignored information was choosing uncertainty over solvency. This is why Sun Tzu argued that intelligence should be funded generously, even when treasuries were strained. Spies, he noted, cost almost nothing compared to armies, and the returns they generated were exponential. An army could consume a nation's wealth in months. A spy could save it in a single night. Modern readers often admire Sun Tzu's subtlety here, his emphasis on deception, infiltration, and foresight. But beneath that elegance lies a brutal economic truth. The cheapest war is the one guided by information, and the most expensive war is the one fought in ignorance. Sun Tzu wasn't teaching rulers how to outsmart enemies. He was teaching them how to stop wasting money while pretending they were being strong. Because in his world, and in every world since, the fastest way to lose a state is not defeat in battle. It's the slow bleed of resources caused by decisions made in the dark. At the core of Sun Tzu's thinking was a concept modern strategists would recognize instantly, even if they use different language today: opportunity cost. Every decision to fight one battle meant abandoning a cheaper alternative. Every march in one direction meant forfeiting flexibility somewhere else. Every soldier committed was capital, no longer available for defense, agriculture, or internal stability. Sun Tzu understood that war was not a single decision. It was a chain of decisions, each one narrowing the future. This is why he was relentlessly opposed to wars fought out of pride, vengeance, or momentum. Those wars felt emotionally justified, but they were strategically catastrophic. They consumed resources without generating proportional returns. Sun Tzu saw rulers repeat the same mistake again and again. They became emotionally invested in conflict. Once invested, they refused to withdraw, even when the cost outweighed the benefit. To Sun Tzu, this was madness. A wise ruler, he argued, must be willing to abandon a campaign the moment it becomes economically irrational. even if retreat feels humiliating. Because humiliation is temporary, bankruptcy is permanent. This is why flexibility appears everywhere in the art of war. Adaptability was not philosophical elegance. It was financial discipline. When conditions changed, so must commitments. When terrain shifted, so must strategy. When costs rose unexpectedly, so must restraint. Sun Tzu believed that rigidity was the most expensive habit a state could develop. A rigid ruler doubled down on failure. A rigid general escalated losses. A rigid system collapsed under pressure. Flexibility preserved optionality. Optionality preserved solvency. And this logic led Sun Tzu to one of his most unsettling conclusions. The greatest danger to a state is not an aggressive enemy, but a leader who cannot let go. A leader who mistakes persistence for wisdom. A leader who confuses sunk costs with commitment. A leader who continues to spend simply because so much has already been spent. Sun Tzu recognized this centuries before modern economics gave it a name. He understood the sunk cost fallacy long before anyone called it that, and he warned that kingdoms had been destroyed by it. Wars were prolonged, not because they were necessary, but because rulers could not admit they had miscalculated. Sun Tzu's solution was brutally simple. Never allow pride to override calculation. Because the moment pride takes control, the treasury follows it into ruin. Sun Tzu did not glorify endurance for its own sake. He glorified endurance only when it preserved the state's future. Everything else, heroics, symbolism, honor, was secondary. To him, the highest form of leadership was knowing when to stop. By the end of the art of war, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Sun Tzu is not building toward a climactic battle. He is building toward a constraint. Again and again, he narrows the acceptable conditions for war until what remains is a stark warning. Only fight when the numbers justify it. And even then, only briefly. This is why his philosophy feels so cold to readers expecting heroism. There is no romance in spreadsheets, no poetry in cost curves, no honor in restraint. But Sun Tzu was writing for rulers, not storytellers. And rulers, he knew, were far more dangerous when they believed their own myths. He watched kings confuse aggression with strength and expansion with stability. He watched them celebrate victories that quietly hollowed out their economies. He watched states win wars and lose the peace immediately afterward. To Sun Tzu, this was the ultimate failure of leadership, achieving a military objective while destroying the conditions that made the state worth defending. That is why he insisted that war must always remain subordinate to governance. A general who wins battles but exhausts the people is not a great general. A ruler who conquers territory but destabilizes the economy is not a great ruler. They are liabilities. Sun Tzu's model places economic health above tactical brilliance. He assumes that a state with a resilient economy can recover from almost any setback, but a state that destroys its own fiscal base will eventually collapse even if it never loses a battle. This insight makes Sun Tzu uncomfortably modern. Because the same logic governs power today, states no longer collapse only because of invasion. They collapse because of debt, because of supply chain fragility, because of resource dependency, because of long conflicts that bleed budgets without producing stability. Sun Tzu would recognize these patterns instantly. He would see modern military budgets as extended campaigns. He would see prolonged foreign interventions as slow-motion economic attrition. He would see leaders escalating commitments not because strategy demands it, but because retreat feels politically unacceptable. And he would issue the same warning he issued millennia ago. When war stops serving the economy will eventually stop serving the state. Sun Tzu did not write a book about dominance. He wrote a book about limits, limits of endurance, limits of finance, limits of pride. He understood that power is not infinite. It must be conserved, allocated, and protected, or it will evaporate under pressure. And that understanding, more than any tactic or aphorism, is what has kept the art of war alive long after the empires that inspired it have vanished. The most unsettling part of Sun Tzu's legacy is how little has changed. The language is ancient, the weapons are different, the scale is larger, but the math is identical. Modern states still convince themselves that war is a test of resolve rather than a test of balance sheets. They still enter conflicts with vague objectives, open-ended timelines, and optimistic assumptions about cost. And they still discover, too late, that the enemy they underestimated was not the opposing army, but time. Sun Tzu would have recognized every modern failure instantly. He would have seen prolonged wars as fiscal hemorrhages. He would have seen swelling defense budgets as deferred insolvency. He would have seen leaders justify escalation using honor, credibility, or deterrence, the same emotional language that ancient kings used to mask poor calculation. To Sun Tzu, these were not moral arguments. They were excuses. Because the moment a state commits to an undefined conflict, it accepts an undefined cost. and undefined costs are how treasuries collapse. This is why Sun Tzu's ideas map so cleanly onto modern strategy. Cyber operations are Sun Tzu. Economic pressure is Sun Tzu. Information warfare is Sun Tzu. Sanctions are Sun Tzu. Proxy conflicts are Sun Tzu. They aim to exhaust an adversary without exhausting yourself. They convert pressure into leverage without converting money into wreckage. They recognize what Sun Tzu recognized first, that power in the modern world belongs to the state that can apply force without destroying its own economic foundation. Even deterrence, the idea of preventing conflict by making it too costly, is pure Sun Tzu logic. Win without fighting. Force restraint through calculation. Preserve strength by limiting exposure. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The tools inspired by Sun Tzu only work when leaders respect the same discipline that guided his thinking. Information without restraint becomes provocation. Pressure without limits becomes escalation. Spending without calculation becomes collapse. Sun Tzu assumed rulers would act rationally. History suggests they rarely do, and so the cycle continues. States learn his lessons in theory, repeat his mistakes in practice, and rediscover, generation after generation, that power divorced from discipline always consumes itself. Sun Tzu never promised victory. He promised survival. If rulers were willing to listen. By the time you reach the end of The Art of War, a quiet realization begins to settle in. Sun Tzu was never trying to make rulers stronger. He was trying to make them less reckless. Every warning he issues about speed, intelligence, deception, restraint points toward the same underlying fear, that leaders, once given power, will spend it without limit. He had watched kingdoms destroy themselves, not because they were weak, but because they were impatient. They mistook action for leadership. They mistook escalation for resolve. They mistook persistence for wisdom, and they paid for it with empty treasuries, fractured societies, and revolts that followed victory like unpaid debts. Sun Tzu understood that collapse rarely arrives in the heat of battle. It arrives afterward, when the soldiers return, when the fields are untended, when the tax collectors knock, and when the population realizes that the price of glory has exceeded its value. This is why he framed war as a matter of state survival rather than national pride. War, he argued, was the most dangerous policy decision a ruler could ever make, not because it risked defeat, but because it risked overextension. Once a state commits beyond its means, it enters a trap of its own making. It cannot withdraw without humiliation. It cannot continue without insolvency. Sun Tzu saw this trap clearly, and he devoted his life's work to explaining how to avoid it, not through heroics, not through domination, not through endless force, but through calculation. He believed the highest form of strength was the ability to say no, to resist the temptation to fight when fighting would cost more than it could ever return. In that sense, Sun Tzu was not a general at all. He was a steward, a guardian of the state's long-term viability, a voice of restraint in an age intoxicated by ambition. And the tragedy he anticipated is not that rulers would misunderstand him, it's that they would understand him perfectly and ignore him anyway. Sun Tzu's greatest insight was not about how to fight, it was about how not to collapse. He understood, centuries before modern economics, that war is the most expensive decision a state can ever make, and the least forgiving when miscalculated. Armies can be rebuilt. Territory can be reclaimed. Pride can be repaired. But once the economic foundation of a state fractures, nothing else matters. Sun Tzu did not fear enemies. He feared leaders who treated war as an expression of strength rather than a liability to be managed. He feared rulers who chased glory without calculating cost, who escalated conflicts without defining limits, and who mistook endurance for wisdom. Because history shows that states do not fall when they lose battles. They fall when they exhaust the capital that holds them together. This is why the art of war endures. Not because it teaches dominance, not because it glorifies conquest, but because it forces an uncomfortable question that every generation of power must answer. What can you afford to fight, and what can you not? Sun Tzu believed that the strongest ruler was not the one who struck hardest, but the one who knew when not to strike at all. That stability mattered more than spectacle. That restraint outlasted aggression. That solvency was the truest measure of power. And history, again and again, has proven him right. History doesn't repeat. But if you ignore its math, it will cost you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe.